or the Ritz-Carlton. But none of this such finery and frill would become the context in which Mary would come to welcome in her precious cargo. Hollywood has produced a genre of television episodes and movies about the wacky hijinks of going into labor and giving birth in unexpected ways and in unhoped for places. Back seats of taxicabs, elevators, airplanes. And there is usually an underprepared and often unlikely companion running around asking, "Someone get some towels, someone boil some water." And all of that bubbling buffoonery is usually comically juxtaposed upon a backstory of the expectant mother having planned precisely how she imagined it would all go. Down to the packed suitcase placed by the front door that now, in this unexpected turn, still sits there, unclaimed and unused. The delivery of my own twin daughters came about somewhat unexpectedly. We were prepared, but the due date, even the early due date they give you for multiple births, was still several weeks away. Amanda had worked late attending a fundraising gala for the nonprofit where she was working at the time. And I was back at the church working on the strategic planning homework that Rob Towns had given us at St. Francis to do until about 9 o'clock that night. We both arrived home exhausted from that long day and fell into bed asleep. Then the next thing I remember was Amanda leaning over me and gently shaking my shoulder in bed around midnight and saying very calmly in her Amanda way, "It's time." It is reported to me that my reply was, "Time for what? You just fell asleep." Then in our own wacky hijinks, we got to the hospital, pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, found the maternity ward entrance, and that all happened by 1 a.m. I don't remember much else till the girls arrived. Mary and Joseph had not really planned to go to Bethlehem for the birth. This was not a vacation. They were not visiting family for the holidays. Mary and Joseph went to Bethlehem because they had to. There was no choice. Augustus had decreed that there would be a census throughout the empire, which meant throughout the whole world as far as he was concerned. Some translations tell us it was a census, some call it an enrollment or registration, as our text today says. Others still call it a taxation. Whatever the nature of the event, it was ultimately, no doubt, conducted for the financial benefit of the empire. This was also a reordering event, a reordering of the people. Large numbers of people must have been at least temporarily displaced, as it was necessary to return to one's ancestral hometown in order for the registration to take place. Bethlehem was about 90 miles from Nazareth, and as such, this had been a long journey on foot, especially with Mary in the last days of her pregnancy. And upon arrival, there was no place for them to stay. Despite this being Joseph's ancestral hometown, there was no family, no friends, and the vacancy light at the local inn was turned off. The menu smelling stable was secured, and the feed trough was cleared out to rest the child that would arrive shortly after all of this. came to pass. From what we know from Scripture and tradition, Mary and Joseph were not itinerant wayfarers who had no place to lay their head. They had a home in Nazareth. Joseph had a job. And while he would not have been wealthy necessarily as a carpenter, his was a way of making a decent living. The story of Mary and Joseph in Bethlehem is a story about two people who just happened to find themselves stuck in a bad situation. This census trip could not have come at a worse time. It was a convergence of what the world had in store for everyone and their time to bring this child into being. And as for the problem at the end, well, we all know there were no Airbnb or Priceline apps back then. But despite all of this, despite this rock and this hard place between which Mary and Joseph find themselves stuck, into this unbearable situation, the light breaks in. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. And so from this story that begins in those days, what then is the good news for those of us who live in these days? The good news of this very particular story is that of the companioning power of Christ. Into the sadness and isolation of the story of Mary and Joseph, stranded